My sister stole $10,000 from me and blamed it on her husband, who took the fall for it. I'm a 32-year-old guy who's been pretty lucky in life so far. Got a decent job in IT, a small house I own outright, and no major drama to speak of, until recently, that is. My family's always been tight-knit, or at least that's how it looked from the outside. There's me, my parents, and my older sister, Jen. She's 35, married to a guy named Mark, and they've got 2 kids, a boy and a girl, ages 7 and 4. Growing up, Jen was the golden child. She got straight A's, never got in trouble, and always had this air about her like she was destined for greatness. My parents ate it up. They'd always tell me how I should be more like her, how she was the responsible one. I didn't mind too much back then. I was just a kid trying to figure things out. But looking back, it's clear she had them wrapped around her finger. Jen and I got along fine when we were younger. She'd help me with homework sometimes, and we'd play video games together when our parents weren't hovering. But as we got older, things shifted. She went off to college, got a fancy business degree, and landed a job at some marketing firm. I stuck closer to home, went to a community college, and worked my way into tech. She'd come back for holidays acting like she was above everyone else, dropping hints about her big salary and how she was making moves. I just nodded and kept my mouth shut. Meanwhile, I was quietly saving every penny I could, building a little nest egg for myself. I didn't need to flex. I liked my life simple. My parents are typical suburban folks. Dad's a retired mechanic, Mom's a part-time receptionist at a dentist's office. They're proud of both of us, but Jen always got the louder applause. They'd brag about her promotions or how Mark was such a great catch for her. Mark's an okay guy, I guess. He's quiet, works in construction, and seems to just go along with whatever Jen says. I never got super close to him, but he's been around for about a decade now, so he's family too. The kids are cute, loud, but cute. We'd all get together for Thanksgiving or Christmas at my parents' place, and it was usually chill. No big fights, no bad blood. At least, that's how I thought it was. I've always been the practical one. While Jen was out there chasing status, I was stashing cash in a safe in my basement. Not a fancy safe, just one of those fireproof ones you get at a hardware store. I didn't trust banks with everything, call it paranoia or whatever, but I liked having some control. Only my family knew about it. I'd told my parents the code years ago in case something happened to me, and Jen found out one time when she was over and I had to grab something from it. She didn't say much about it then, just nodded and changed the subject. I figured it wasn't a big deal. Their family, right? You're supposed to trust them. That's how it's been my whole life, me, Jen, Mom, and Dad, all on the same team. Or so I thought. One day in February, I went to the basement to add some cash to the safe. I'd gotten a $500 bonus at work and figured I'd stash it. I punched in the code, 12-34-56, and opened the door. The stack of bills looked thinner than it should have. I pulled everything out and counted it, $15,000. Exactly $10,000 was gone. I checked the floor, the shelves, even inside the safe again, thinking maybe I'd misplaced it. Nothing. The money was missing. I hadn't touched it since Christmas, and no one else had been in my house except family. Only my parents and Jen knew the code. No one else could have opened it. I sat there for a while, staring at the safe. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a mistake. I don't miscount $10,000. Someone took it. And since only my family knew the code, it had to be one of them. I didn't want to believe it, but the facts were clear. The money didn't just vanish. After finding the money missing from my safe, I drove to my parents' house. It was a Tuesday evening, and they were home as usual. I didn't call ahead, I just showed up, still shaken from what I'd discovered in the basement. The safe was locked when I opened it, no signs of damage, so whoever took the cash knew how to get in. That meant it was someone in the family. I couldn't see my parents doing it, they'd never seemed desperate. But Jen had been acting strange lately. She'd brought up how tough things were with the kids' school and Mark's truck breaking down. It stuck in my mind. When I got there, Mom was in the kitchen making tea, and Dad was watching TV in the living room. I walked in and told them the money was gone from my safe. Mom stopped stirring and looked at me, confused. Dad turned off the sound on the TV and asked how I knew. I said only family had access, and no one else had been in my house. Mom asked if I was sure it wasn't a mistake. I said I wasn't imagining it. Dad rubbed his forehead and said it didn't add up. I told them I thought Jen took it. Mom's face stiffened, and she said Jen wouldn't do something like that. Dad stayed quiet at first, just staring at the floor. I pointed out Jen had been to my place recently, dropping off old clothes for donation, and she'd been hinting at financial stress. Mom shook her head and said Jen's job was solid, she didn't need to steal. Dad finally said maybe I was wrong, maybe it wasn't what I thought. I told him I wasn't wrong. The room went silent. Mom said we should talk to Jen before assuming anything. Dad agreed, said it was a family issue, and we'd sort it out together. I wanted to confront her right then, but they wouldn't budge. They called Jen and told her to come over the next day with Mark and the kids. They didn't tell her why, just that it was important. I left their place feeling worse than before. I was sure Jen was behind it, but I didn't have solid proof yet, just the fact that the money was gone. The next day, Jen showed up at my parents' house with Mark and the kids. It was late afternoon, and I'd been waiting there since morning, pacing the living room. Mom and Dad had kept things calm, making small talk about the weather and the kids' school projects. Jen walked in looking like her usual self, put together, confident, like nothing was wrong. Mark trailed behind her, carrying a bag of toys for the kids. The kids ran off to the backyard to play, leaving the adults inside. I didn't waste time. Once everyone was settled in the living room, I said the money was missing from my safe and asked Jen why she took it. Jen's face didn't change at first. She leaned back on the couch, crossed her arms, and said she didn't know what I was talking about. I told her only family knew about the safe, and she'd been to my place recently. She shrugged and said she'd never touched my stuff. Then, out of nowhere, she turned to Mark and said it was him. She said he'd been stressed about work, that he must have gotten the code from her somehow and taken it behind her back. Mark looked up surprised but didn't argue. He just nodded and said yeah, it was him. He said he was sorry, that he'd messed up. I didn't buy it. Mark's voice was flat, like he was reading a script. Jen sat there, watching him take the blame, not even blinking. Mom gasped and started asking Mark why he'd do something like that. Dad shook his head, disappointed. I told Mark I'd call the police if he didn't come clean. He just stared at the floor and said to go ahead, he deserved it. Jen jumped in, saying she couldn't believe he'd betrayed the family like this, acting shocked. The kids came back inside then, interrupting everything, and Jen used it as an excuse to leave with them. Mark followed her out, head down. Mom and Dad sat there, stunned, talking about how they never saw this coming from him. After Jen and Mark left my parents' house, I drove home. The whole thing kept replaying in my head, Jen pointing at Mark, Mark agreeing so fast, her acting like she was betrayed. It didn't sit right. I got back to my place and sat in the basement, staring at the safe. It was still locked, just like always, no scratches, no dents. Only family knew how to open it. Mark could have gotten the code from Jen, sure, but something about his confession felt off. He didn't fight it, didn't explain why he needed the money or what he did with it. He just took the fall. Jen, though, she'd been too quick to blame him, too calm about it. I started thinking about the last time Jen was over. She dropped off those clothes, stayed maybe an hour. I'd left her alone for a bit to take a call from work. The basement door wasn't locked. She could have gone down there, opened the safe, taken the cash, and walked out like nothing happened. Mark wasn't even with her that day. The more I thought about it, the more it lined up. Jen had the chance, she knew the safe, and she'd been hinting at money troubles for weeks. Mark didn't strike me as the type to steal. He's quiet, follows her lead. It started to feel like she'd set him up. I couldn't shake the idea that Jen was lying. She'd always been the perfect one in the family, the one who could do no wrong. Maybe she'd gotten used to that, figured she could pull this off and no one would suspect her. Mark taking the blame just made it easier for her. I didn't have proof yet, but the pieces were falling into place. I decided I wasn't letting this go. If she did it, I'd find out. The next few days, I couldn't focus on anything else. Work was a blur. I'd sit at my desk, staring at code, thinking about Jen and that safe. I started going over everything I knew about her lately. She'd been at my place alone that day with the clothes. She'd complained about bills more than usual over the holidays, saying stuff about the kids' school and Mark's truck. I remembered her asking me once, months back, how much I kept in the safe, just casual, like she was curious. I'd brushed it off then, didn't think much of it. Now it felt like a clue. I called Mom to see if Jen had said anything weird lately. Mom didn't want to talk about it at first, she was still upset about Mark. I pushed, asked if Jen had borrowed money or seemed stressed. Mom said Jen had asked them for a loan a while back, something about unexpected costs, but they turned her down because they didn't have much to spare. That stuck with me. If she couldn't get cash from them, maybe she'd turn to me instead, without asking. Dad got on the phone and said he still couldn't believe Mark would steal, that it didn't fit. I told him I wasn't sure it was Mark anymore. He went quiet, didn't argue. I thought about confronting Jen again, but I needed more than a hunch. Mark's confession was the only thing protecting her, and he wasn't talking. I started wondering if she told him to cover for her, maybe guilt him into it. He's always been soft when it comes to her. I decided to watch her closer, see if she slipped up. The family was meeting again soon. Mom's birthday was coming up. I'd get my chance there. Mom's birthday was a week later, and the whole family gathered at their house. Jen showed up with Mark and the kids, acting normal, smiling, helping Mom with the cake, like nothing had happened. Mark stayed quiet, sticking to the edges of the room. I watched them both, waiting for the right moment. After dinner, when everyone was in the living room, I brought it up. I said the money was still missing, and I didn't believe Mark took it. Jen froze, her face going stiff. Mom looked confused, and Dad asked what I meant. I said it had to be someone who knew about the safe, someone who'd been in my house alone. I looked straight at Jen and said she was the only one who fit. She tried to laugh it off, said I was crazy, that Mark already admitted it. Mark nodded, backing her up, but his eyes didn't meet mine. I kept going. I said she'd been at my place by herself, had time to get into the safe, and had been talking about money problems for months. I brought up how she'd asked Mom and Dad for a loan and got turned down. Jen's voice got sharp. She told me to stop accusing her, that I was ruining the day. Mom started to defend her, saying I was out of line. Dad just watched, silent. I didn't back down. I said Mark's confession didn't make sense. He had no reason to know about the safe unless she told him, and he didn't act like someone who'd stolen anything. Jen stood up, face red, and said I was wrong, that I couldn't prove it. But everyone was looking at her now, not me. Dad finally spoke, asked her point blank if she took it. She hesitated, just for a second, then said no. That pause was enough. Mom went quiet. Mark stared at the floor. The room felt heavy, and Jen's perfect image cracked right there. After that night at Mom's birthday, things unraveled fast. Jen left with Mark and the kids, barely saying goodbye. Mom called me the next day, upset, asking why I'd turned it into a scene. I told her I couldn't let it go. Someone took the money, and Jen was the only one who made sense. Dad got on the phone and said he'd been thinking about it too. He didn't want to believe it, but Jen's reaction stuck with him. She'd always been the golden child, the one they trusted, and now that trust was gone. Mark never said a word after that night, didn't try to defend himself or her. A few days later, Jen texted me. She didn't admit it outright, just said she was sorry things got messy and asked me to drop it for the family's sake. I didn't reply. I didn't need her to confess. The way she acted, the way Mark took the fall, it was clear enough. She'd stolen from me, blamed him, and thought she'd get away with it because no one ever questioned her. The family started seeing her differently after that. Mom stopped bringing her up in every conversation, and Dad mentioned once that he felt like he didn't know her anymore. They didn't cut her off, but the shine was gone. I never got the money back. I could have gone to the police, but it'd be my word against hers, and Mark would probably stick to his story. I decided it wasn't worth the fight, family's messy enough without lawyers. I changed the safe's code, moved it somewhere else in the house, and started keeping my distance from Jen. She's still my sister, but I don't trust her anymore. The whole thing left a mark, on me, on the family. Jen's not the ideal she used to be, and I'm not the quiet brother who lets things slide. That's where it stands now.